there. Welcome to the Carr Brothers Show. It's episode 135. I'm Jack.
And I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jody, the third of the three Carr brothers. Well, we're very pleased to have an economist with the University of New Brunswick, very well known in New Brunswick and Canada as Herb Emery. Well, Herb, it's so great to have you. Yes, returning. We had you on last fall. So.
Great to be here again.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And you're going to help us and our viewers learn a little bit about tariffs, trade agreements and cross-border trading and interprovincial trading, and we really appreciate you being on the show.
My pleasure.
So let's get really down to a basic question: is what is a tariff, and what's sort of going on today with what we're all hearing about?
So a tariff is a tax.
Okay.
So we can demystify it right away. It's just a tax that's selectively applied to certain goods and services by country of origin. And so the intention of it is to get consumers and businesses that buy inputs to substitute away from one country and into one that isn't taxed. And so the consequence of it is it often means that you're discouraging buyers from going from the low-cost provider, supplier, and moving to a higher cost but preferred supplier. So it's called protectionism. And tariffs in the past have played a role when they were lower in value. They were mainly for revenue purposes, so a small tax that a government could collect revenue it needed to operate. So historically around Confederation, that was how most governments, before Confederation, the colonies collected that way, and then they ceded that to the federal government, and the federal government got single authority to use the tariff tax instrument. And then later on, countries started using tariffs as a protectionist measure to keep other producers out and force them to produce in the economy for the domestic market. Most of us who are of a certain age grew up in a Canada like that. So up until 1993, we were in a tariff-protected country full of branch plants producing for the domestic market. And if you remember, we had very limited variety of goods. If you went to the United States, we were always shocked by how many colors were available in shoes and T-shirts. They seemed to have bigger cans of things like pop, and they had lower prices. And so as a consequence, Canada at a certain point, when it was hitting productivity challenges and lower incomes and stagnant things, high unemployment, they started asking, well, how do we boost our incomes and our productivity? And they realized we give up on protectionism. We go into free trade with the larger U.S. market. We exploit economies of scale. We stop doing the things we're not good at, like making washers and dryers, and we move into doing things like pulp and paper, eventually oil refining, and things that we were comparatively good at. And that's the economy for 30 years that we've been benefiting from. And that's what's at risk today.
So what did you, were you surprised when Donald Trump, the president of the U.S., announced, I guess, a 25% tariff on U.S. goods and Canadian goods in the United States?
I wasn't surprised by Trump since he's been promising to do it. We've already had one experience with him. And even Joe Biden was moving in a protectionist direction. But he was using subsidies for producers in the U.S. to move there, particularly for green technology, whereas we were taxing. So we were already out of line with the United States in terms of competitiveness. So the thing I was most shocked by was how flat-footed the federal and provincial governments were when Trump won. Then it became clear that they obviously hadn't thought about what happens if he wins and what happens if he follows through on tariffs, as he did last time. So what we've seen is a flurry of activity of everyone swinging into action saying, what are we going to do? But our current premier, Susan Holt, was working in the premier's office the last time around this happened. So she should have been familiar, and I think she is familiar with what steps were taken to defend against the tariff or ride it out. And then you have to ask the question, how are we caught so unprepared after the fact that we've been through this once? It was going to happen again under the same guy. And now it's sort of turning into, he seems a little more unhinged and unbridled, but there actually is a method to his madness, which I haven't seen our politicians and decision makers really taking to heart yet.
Yeah.
Well, it did seem, even after he was elected in the fall, between then and his inauguration, it seemed like it wasn't really taken seriously. Like as you got closer to his inauguration day, and then afterwards is when they threw the committee into place and had the ministers start going down to see their counterparts, and Trudeau fly to Mar-a-Lago. So it just seemed like it wasn't taken seriously even from the fall until the new year either, which is kind of shocking.
Well, it sort of stems from what you would call elitist thinking that was coming from Canada and even from the Democrats in the U.S., that if you start from the premise that Trump just doesn't know what he's doing, Americans are stupid, they don't understand how important Canada is for them and the free trade agreement, it signals right away you're not listening to what they've been saying, you're not looking at who he's talking to. And it turns out there's an influential report that Jack Mintz identified in one of his Financial Post commentaries, which laid out the case for Trump's tariffs. And if you look at it, it makes a lot of sense what he thinks he's going to do. We don't know if he's right. But if I were a prime minister or a premier, I'd be paying a lot of attention to the logic that Trump believes is there. Because if you go down and tell him, you've benefited from us taking your jobs, which is how he sees it, or you benefited from us having a low-value dollar against your dollar, you're walking right into his trap, which is he thinks free trade has been a lousy deal for the states. He sees it coming through a currency channel, not a trade channel. So in his mind, because the United States is the reserve currency for the globe, it means that their dollar has a higher value against other currencies because people hold it for means other than just trading for goods and services. And as a consequence, his view is we've been unfairly advantaged in Canada by a low-value dollar. China's been advantaged by a low-value currency, and so on and so on. And it turns out from that framework, a protective across-the-board tariff is a way to correct that imbalance. And if he's right, or what he's gambling on, is that he will devalue our currency. If with a 25% tariff, he will devalue our currency by 25%, taking us to 50 cents US.
Wow.
And if he does that, there's no increase in prices for the US, there's no change in trade patterns, but we will be poorer because we pay more for everything we import. We will still have our jobs, it's just they won't buy us as much. So you got to export a lot more French fries in order to get that Lexus.
Same amount, right.
So that's his logic. Now, when you go down to him and say, don't you understand how much trade you have with us? His point is it's unfair trade. He thinks that we're too rich. We've got rich at the expense of the U.S. And so the kinds of arguments I hear the politicians in Canada saying they want to give him just aren't going to carry water with how he's viewing the trade relationship.
Has his mind made up on the philosophy on it.
Yeah, although he's starting to deviate by going to selective tariffs on aluminum and steel, which will undermine his goal of devaluing our currency, because now if you're only going after certain goods, you're going to move the industry, shift the trade pattern, but not necessarily the currency.
So America, we'll keep that our little secret.
But Americans will start to see much higher prices as a consequence.
So is his thinking that because the Canadian dollar is lower, that Americans are buying Canadian goods at a cheaper value? Is that what?
Sort of. It's a bit more than that. He sees that the jobs have come up here because once you take account of what we pay a worker behind a lower dollar, we became a place for cheap labor.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And so you locate the production here, especially for the low value added
stuff. So the costs are lower that way.
We get a cost advantage through the currency, not through our productivity or anything else.
Basically, the cost of the product or the good is lower, and therefore the Americans want to buy from us. So he's trying to say they should be, either subsidized, manufacturing, making those goods in the U.S. or those products that they are getting. He's basically putting a tax though on his own people in a way, isn't he?
He is, unless our currency depreciates.
Right.
If the currency doesn't appreciate, which is how our current governments are interpreting it, so he is taxing his own people. But he's using the tax to get them their jobs back. So we won't process lobster in PEI in New Brunswick, we'll process it in Maine. So what we have to remember with tariffs is it's not everybody's harmed or everybody's helped. There are people under a tariff who do better than other people. And one thing under free trade is it tilted the balance away from unskilled, low-educated workers who could get a good manufacturing job towards highly educated people who do financial services and more of the knowledge economy stuff. So if you look at Trump's base and what's happened to the Republicans, they used to be the more educated of the two parties in the U.S., but now the high educated went to the Democrats, and if you look at the Republicans, they tend to have fewer people with a college degree amongst their support, more blue collar. And they want their jobs back. They want to be treated with respect, and free trade didn't help them. And we shouldn't be shocked by this because the same cleavage is in England with Brexit.
Good.
It was The EU benefited the high educated, highly mobile, knowledge type of workers, especially young, but the people who were out in the old manufacturing areas that lost their jobs and couldn't go anywhere, they were angry and they wanted out of the EU, and that Brexit found its audience, and they sacrificed a whole bunch of GDP and well-being in order to stick it to the people that they thought weren't respecting them and weren't listening to them.
And that's his market. That's Trump's market to that type of voter or worker, and he's going to fight for America, and that's basically, they're going to be happy from that perspective. And how it all waters out.
Well, the beauty is, by the time everyone figures out it didn't work,
Yeah,
it
right.
got worse, he's out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in the short run, there's going to be a lot of profits to be made, especially watching the stock market move up and down with his announcements.
Yeah.
Well, he certainly is affecting the markets every time he opens one of his books to sign, or he says anything. And we've all been told as elected officials in the past, like, we need to be careful about how we talk about certain things publicly, especially in the forestry sector, oil and gas, because it affects markets. And he's doing it like to a T, purposely, obviously. But he even said the other day when he brought on the steel and the aluminum that it was all about having this stuff manufactured in the factories open up again in the U.S. He makes no bones about it.
He does, but it's just kind of weird because a lot of the companies he's going to hurt are actually often arms of a U.S. company.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the complexities that his worldview doesn't appreciate is that the intertwining of all these supply chains and
Back and
corporate interests, like we're going to come down to what's a Canadian firm. And if it's an American firm that owns the capacity in Canada, should they be tariffed or should they be exempt? He wants our banking sector opened up, so we now have to figure out when is a bank a Canadian bank, or
Right.
what are the foreign ownership limits. So there's a lot of things he's going to open up in Canada as a debate, where we've tried to historically protect Canadian ownership of these major protected industries, telecoms, banking, dairy,
Yeah.
things along those lines. So it's going to get complicated.
Well, what is your view? Do you think that Canada has an unfair advantage over the United States? Do you see that as in line with what Trump is saying, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's more complicated because we also have low productivity because of that dollar. So there's a lot of Canadian economists in the 1990s who wanted us to just take the U.S. currency.
Oh, yes.
And the reason for doing that is they felt we were hanging on to too many low productivity, low value added jobs because we were protected by a low dollar. And the solution to boost our well-being would be to finally just do the shakeout, get rid of those low value added firms. Now, when you start getting into the Maritimes, that's a lot of our manufacturing base, especially seafood processing. Yes. So when they were saying, let's take the dollar to par, we did get that experiment closer to 2008 when the price of oil was going through the roof, and you started hearing Central Canadians screaming Dutch disease is killing our manufacturing industry. Harper then threw $4 billion in subsidies to save the auto sector, and then they went on to hamstring the energy sector so that the dollar would go back down to 70 cents, 80 cents, where everybody was more comfortable. Like, the real problem with the exchange rate was when it stayed low, like in the 90s, around 60 cents. Union workers made a lot of gains, especially in the auto sector. So they were able to bid up their wages as long as the dollar was low, because they were still relatively cheap compared to an American auto worker. When the dollar starts going up, you started seeing a real threat to, can we keep these plants in Canada if these guys won't take wage concessions? So we became so dependent on a cheap dollar to drive our competitiveness that it staved off probably 2 decades of effort to raise productivity, invest in new technologies, automation. But then most of our problems are own goals by government policy. So you can't sell your family manufacturing business to a family member on the same terms as someone else. So in our region, when I moved here, a big problem was founders are aging out. They can't sell the firm. So they're just winding it up. They're not investing in new capital to keep it going.
Yeah.
That's a policy decision our government's made, not an economic reality. And so if you think about how do you keep these companies investing, you have to increase the founder and entrepreneur's time horizon. And Canadian governments have been terrific about shortening that time horizon so that you don't want to invest here. You don't know if it's going to be a stable place to do business. And now with the tariffs, until someone resolves the uncertainty, why would you invest anything here?
Yeah, it's pretty uncertain. And what's your confidence in, we talked about slow off the mark with the federal and provincial governments. What's your confidence right now in the federal and provincial governments in understanding even a portion of what you're saying and having counter kind of strategy?
So they're doing political survival in my mind. They have to show they're swinging into action. They're going to be tough. They're going to stand up to a bully. What they're not doing is the stuff they could be doing, which is taking a hard look at the cost of doing business in New Brunswick and Canada and saying, if tariffs are coming in at 10%, 25%, can we take a look at all those policies, regulations, and things that have made us less competitive over time? And can we do things, policy reforms, tax reform, that could take 10%, 25% out of producer costs permanently in the region and in Canada? And at that point, they've taken action on things they control to offset the tariff disadvantage. I don't hear any of them talking about it.
No, because I hear compensation and subsidies and whatnot.
And you hear Anita and Nan saying that we can remove the majority of the interprovincial trade barriers in 30 days, but nobody really talks about what that means and what it is. And we've asked those questions different times.
Is there a lot of GDP or market to gain between interprovincial besides alcohol?
I mean, they keep saying it's $200 billion, but nobody defines it. And you're right. Does the provincial governments have an action team, a crisis action team working on these things? Maybe, but we've not heard.
So if you go back to why do we have interprovincial trade barriers in the first place, it was, again, to protect your local home market for services like trucking and things like that. You had a lot of local interests that didn't want to be competing with outside trucking firms and things along those lines. And they're there for a reason. They served a political purpose. They did prop up business. And so when you talk about removing them, it's not like this clinical thing where we've just been hiding all this wealth and it's going to spring up. It's going to grow, but it's not necessarily going to go where you want it to. So let's suppose we drop our pants and Quebec keeps theirs up. Who do you think wins that draw?
Yeah. Right.
And so
they
you have
this when the pants are on both.
Right. You've got to think about this is a coordination problem. Who goes first?
Yeah.
Do we go at the same time? Because we can unilaterally drop all of our restrictions against other provinces right now and see how it goes. And what you'll see is a lot of capital moving down the road.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to be here.
Has to be a concerted effort.
It has to be coordinated. It could be Anita and Anda's talking about federal restrictions on labor mobility and goods mobility or federal regulations, but we have a whole bunch of other things just about how do you tax labor. So minimum wages differ across provinces. Companies have branches in each province. They've been asking for harmonization for ages. When I moved here, there was supposed to be a red tape reduction committee across all 4 provinces.
Well, I know under our government, we always reduce I forget how many thousands of regulations.
We all claim we do it under our government.
It's tough to do, and then
we actually had someone designated, but then he got fired. So
it got too close.
We're going to stop there. We're going to stop there on that discussion.
Okay.
Just for a second, we're going to come back after a few messages from our public service announcements, and we're going to keep digging into the internal trade barriers and what that actually means and help people understand it more fully. So come back in a few minutes.
Hi there, welcome back to the Carr Brothers Show. It's episode 135. I'm Jack.
And I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jody, the third of the 3 Carr brothers. Well, we're very pleased to have UNB economist Herb Emery with us. He's back with us. He was here last fall when we talked about carbon pricing and carbon tax and things like that. Now we're talking about tariffs between the U.S. and Canada, and also trade relations as well between the 2 countries and also interprovincially. So we're very pleased to have you on here, Herb, and help us to understand the tariffs, which, as you mentioned, is a form of a tax, and also how that relates to the Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar. And how about you just help continue us to learn about how this issue affects us?
Sure. So when we teach economics, this is actually one of the topics that students struggle with the most because it starts to get very complicated when you have all these different dimensions of how the market can adjust. But if you think about the simplest terms, let's suppose we have a producer in Moncton and one in Fredericton. We have a new government that really likes Moncton. And so as a consequence, they want to get more goods into the market from Moncton, so they put a tax on any supplier or producer from Fredericton. So now as a consumer, I have a choice. I can buy from Moncton or I can buy from Fredericton. Now, am I going to pay a higher price for the good from Fredericton?
No, it would make
Of course
sense.
not.
No, so I'm going to look at the Moncton firm, and in that firm, if they start noticing there's more demand for what they have, they will hire more people and expand at the expense of the Fredericton firm. Now, the Fredericton firm may in response say, well, we're just going to have to eat the additional cost. They'll take a lower margin or lower profit in order to keep the firm. So it may be that you still have a firm the same size in Moncton and a firm the same size in Fredericton, but now the government has more revenue because they tax the Fredericton production, but everybody in Fredericton is poorer because of the policy. Now, let's suppose that we started issuing Canadian Tire bucks or one of those new currencies that only circulates in Fredericton. And you have to exchange it for real currency in order to buy stuff from Moncton and other places. And there's an exchange rate. And so you put your picture of that Duffy McDuff guy that used to be on the Canadian Tire money, and you could exchange it at par, but then you start noticing that people are nervous that you may not be worth it, so they start giving you 50 cents on your currency against a real dollar. Now you have a problem that you're selling your stuff with Canadian Tire money coming in as payment, but you have to buy from the Moncton guys to get other things that you need, and they need Canadian dollars. So they may wind up, no one pays the higher tariff because you're able to swallow it through your devalued currency, but you're still poorer. Now, when you flip it around and ask what happened to the country that's got the tariffs, you're worse off all around because your dollar's worth less on the one hand, or if your government decides to countervail and put more tariffs on, you're being taxed, and you have no way to offset it.
Right.
So
if we counter with on tariffs that Canada does, I mean, we're going to get the double whammy in Canada.
Right. But
Over time.
So take orange juice, which the Premier likes to talk about a lot. So let's take the U.S. brand. We're going to tax it, which means we now have to source our orange juice from somewhere else. The first question we should be asking, well, if this was such a great idea, why weren't we just buying it from somewhere else to begin with? And the answer is it was more expensive.
Right.
And we've learned through the cost of living crisis, Canadians don't like paying much for anything.
Yeah.
And so now what we're asking everyone to do is to help hit back against the U.S., we want you to buy from the less efficient producers, or even worse, maybe we start putting up greenhouses and growing our own oranges and growing our own New Brunswick orange juice, which is what a lot of people may start talking about.
Right.
You may remember sprung greenhouses with the cucumbers in Newfoundland. So these ideas start to become reasonable behind a tariff wall because there's no competition and they're going to just make us pay for it. And this is true with a whole bunch of other things with interprovincial trade. Like, why is meat so cheap? Because we centralized the processing in a couple places and we had a great logistics and distribution system. And now what we're talking about is getting rid of that to go back to smaller scale, less efficient, local processing. So we will have more food security in one sense. We're going to have a lot more hogs in New Brunswick, I guess. We're going to process our own stuff, but we're going to pay more. And so you're always trading off the security aspect. We produce our own. No one's going to cut us off with tariffs or other disruptions. But we pay for it because we're going to have a lower quality of life because our income won't go as far. We're lower productivity. Everything's more expensive. And we know this because that's the economy I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and it's the one we abandoned after the MacDonald Commission to go to free trade. So Canadians have been lucky. We've had 30 years of uninterrupted expansion and well-being through free trade with the United States. But around 2020, we started seeing things coming out of the federal government that maybe we don't need GDP as much. Maybe we need to focus on other things like people are happy. They started saying things like it's not enough to have successful businesses if it generates inequality. And so we started to see the brakes being put on business and less concern for things like, do we really need NAFTA? And now that it's under threat, they've decided we really need NAFTA. But they sort of felt they won the first time around when Chrystia Freeland went down and came back with whatever the new alphabet name was to appease Trump. But what they didn't do, which is what every government should always be doing, is keeping an eye on what's important.
Yeah.
And if there's a threat to it, getting ahead of it. Instead, over the last 10 years, we've allowed that relationship to erode with the United States.
Yeah.
by playing ball with the United States over Huawei and some other geopolitical things, which is another element of Trump's tariffs, we alienated the Chinese market for canola and a whole bunch of other things. It's not just we had our business people thrown in jail, we actually lost access to their markets. And so the Trudeau government in 2015, remember, was going to take us to China, give us a new market, and things were going to boom. And then that all went pear-shaped around the first Trump initiatives, because he wanted to pick a fight with China, and if you don't side with them, you're against them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But now, as a consequence, he's using tariffs also as a threat to make us align with his foreign policy and external policies. They're not just for trade anymore. So you're not allowed to disagree with him on an international dispute, or you'll get a tariff. Mm-hmm. Don't pay your NATO share, you get a tariff.
Yeah.
So this isn't trade anymore. This is using it for a geopolitical purpose, which going down and telling them we're not buying your orange juice isn't going to help.
Right. So basically, yeah, the federal governments collectively with provinces, but federal government asleep at the switch for too many years, taken for granted the situation and the deal that we had, and it slowly eroded, and now we're back-footed, I guess, and up against it. And do you see lately any better strategy going on, getting some people in the room with some knowledge about what we should be doing happening, or do you see it still just kind of gimmicky, kind of in terms of let's make it look like we're doing something?
So it's difficult right now to talk about the federal government, who are prorogued and in complete disarray. They're picking a new leader. Nobody's reoffering. Yeah. So effectively, one of our worst economic crises in ages, we have no federal government that's functional, and we have a lame duck prime minister running around the globe trying to, I think, do his best to restore his legacy. Mm-hmm. Provincially, what I'm seeing is the premiers that started out as Team Canada are increasingly turning into Team Me.
Right.
And they're looking for car votes would be my best bet.
Yeah.
But then the more interesting part to me is that business has been moving faster than government on this file for some time. Yeah. They've been already thinking ahead about what does Trump mean, not in ways that necessarily help us, but they're saying, does the next factory go in the United States, or does it go in New Brunswick? Now, the sad part is this silent exit's been going on in New Brunswick for at least a decade, that we know there's all kinds of companies that Gleaner used to celebrate. This manufacturer is now in Tennessee. Yeah. Good for us. And it's like, well, why are they building here? And so again, the competitiveness problem of the region that's come from a lot of policy decisions, including NB Power, is becoming a negative for wanting to produce here, because you can't tell anyone what their costs will be next year. The property tax system is also being reformed right at a time where you want to give predictability. The current government wants to introduce new industrial categories for property tax, which is not a subtle change in our current structure. So what are you going to guarantee producers on their property tax bill? We've already seen what's been happening with landlords, that there's no controls for them. So right at the time we have a government that says they want to help, they're sort of doing some things, going down and pleading their case in the United States, but the things they directly control, like creating certainty over producer costs through energy, through property taxes, through corporate taxes, they're not talking about any of that. And so they're going to have to, and they will come around, I think. But the question with all these things is, do they do it too late? Because business is already moving.
Well, yeah, and they have to be thinking ahead. Business people, they've got to be 10 steps ahead all the time, or they're not going to survive, right? So,
well, and remember that the other thing that we're not talking about is we've cut a whole bunch of businesses off from international workers with the federal policy. Yeah. So Blair Hislop was in the media talking about the challenges Mrs. Dunster's is now facing, just in even staffing its operations. That leads you to things like EI reform. Like, why can't you find workers for some of these jobs? And the reason is we compensate people not to take just any job. Right. And if you compare to the states where they don't have an EI system like ours, it's much stingier and it's state financed with no regional redistribution. You go down, they've got all kinds of young people working in Dunkin' Donuts, older folks. So again, they can find workers in the U.S. even though they claim they've got shortages. We have a much harder time here because we don't encourage people to take work. Yeah. Right. And when we've tried to do this in a more sensible way with a basic income, the main complaint is you're going to make people not work, but they're already not working.
Right. And remember, Harper tried to address that in around 2013 or so, and the outcry was just tremendous. Really trying to take some steps back then, and Danny Soucy was our pedal minister at the time, or labor minister at the time, and Keith Ashfield was our federal MP, and it was very there was a lot of unrest with people. They were very upset about it, and voted Harper out. Basically, New Brunswick was a big part of it, and the Alberta government paid some of the price on that too, because some of our ministers sided with Harper. Looking back now, I guess reform was needed in the EI system to not give people such an easy ride.
Well, and remember that the reform was also for national efficiency goals, because there's a view that too many workers are in this region. They were needed out west, and it was the EI system trapping them in. So we're going to run into this conflicting national priority versus regional priority. And going back to interprovincial trade barriers, how do you defend against the national interest? You need your own barriers.
Yeah, that's
Because-
why they're there.
Ontario and Quebec's goal to grow has to be at the expense of other regions, because in the world of scale, if it's not going to be resource-based, you're going to put the manufacturing where you've got the people, you've got the scale, the size, the access to market.
Transportation, yeah.
And right now, it's not here. We don't have rail the same way they do in the rest of Canada.
Wow. So we're really in a tight spot here in New Brunswick for when you summarize all that, when you look at the protection that we have right now in New Brunswick for interprovincial, but then tie in, as you mentioned, the property tax for industry that they're looking at, energy, corporate tax, immigration policy from the federal government. There's a lot of challenges right now for the premier and the government. And how do you get Danielle Smith to make sure we're all working together? And as you say, without then negotiating, having the U.S. negotiate these one-offs or carve-outs, and someone's going to just basically take what they can and survive. And anyway, there's a lot of complexity going on.
So remember with Danielle Smith, she's got another threat to Canadian federalism. She's demanding most of the assets from the Canada Pension Plan.
Yes. Yeah.
Which the effect of that would be she's trying to lower her labor tax rate by 2 percentage points. It would raise ours by another 3 to 4. So that combined employee-employer contribution becomes another labor cost. The federal government's trying to push back on it, but unfortunately they wrote lousy legislation when they created the investment fund, and Alberta may actually have a case.
Because is that not what Quebec does with their pensioners? No.
So Quebec was never in, so they've always had a separate one.
Okay. Yeah.
But there was a provision for the rest of Canada that any province could withdraw, and they're entitled to take out all of the assets plus interest that have accumulated.
That their province put in, or that their workers put in.
What it was intended to be before there was an investment fund was there was a small kind of reserve created by provincial bonds. So the legislation was written with a much smaller fund in mind, and what Smith is claiming is that Albertans being younger have paid in but haven't been pulling out. So I'm a classic example. I paid in Alberta for 25 years and I'm in New Brunswick. She's claiming all of my historic contributions plus interest and telling you guys you can pay for me.
Wow. So it's that in itself, those are fighting words, but that in itself is very complex, because a lot of our workers, citizens, were working in Alberta and are still, but have been, especially in the, and they're contributing there, but then moving back as well, right? So
this is, again, you're going back to asking, can we do a Team Canada approach with Trump? Okay, rewind a bit to when Alberta needed to get to Tidewater to diversify, and all the provinces like BC and Quebec said, you're not coming through here.
Like the pipeline.
So now you go to Alberta and say, we want to talk about Energy East, and instead they're saying, no, we're pulling out. So the firewall stuff that Harper started before he was Prime Minister, Smith has adopted, and it's really a sovereignty separatist type movement. So within that context, whoever the next Prime Minister is has got a real mess just trying to paper over. Quebec's looking back towards sovereignty again. Alberta is moving that direction. BC's as clueless and disengaged as they've always been, but loving life. The Maritimes, it's not clear we have any coordination across the 3 provinces right now. Like Tim Houston's doing his own thing.
And even if we did, what type of impact would that have against the rest of the country? In the grand scheme of things.
So the biggest interprovincial trade barrier that we have that I can tell is if you drive west of here to Quebec, you have to go through that single lane highway, which the trucking industry identified to the federal government in 2016 with the Atlantic Growth Strategy is the biggest headache because you have to decouple the double length trucks and run them through twice. We ran some numbers and asked how big was the GDP cost of having that single lane highway and the friction on trucking. It's $300 million a year in lost GDP for the 3 maritime provinces.
Quebec would love for us to go pay for that twinning.
Yeah, well,
It might be worth it.
they don't want to twin because they want to use it for the jobs, apparently.
Right.
So they're going to be done around 2030, but we started talking about this in 2016. So what's a decade times 300 million that's just flown away? So when you talk about these barriers, the booze trade I know is a big irritant, and I'd love to see Moosehead get more freely into other markets and things like that. But the big ticket items are really around frictions on transportation, free movement of goods, packaging restrictions. Like in Quebec, you can't just sell anything, as I understand it. It has to have certain sizes of language and things like that. So with a lot of this stuff, we haven't dealt with interprovincial trade for 150 years or more, so why do we think in 30 days?
So is trucking permitting, is that part of the issue, or is that fairly like by province? Because I know we all in New Brunswick, if we're crossing borders, we have to have an IFTA sticker on our truck, and we have to pay the province to get that sticker, and we have to report kilometers in each province and how much fuel we buy in each province. So is that more of a red tape, time-consuming issue, or is that costing truckers between provinces?
It's all of the above.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so the problem is we don't know how to explain the costs of regulation.
Right.
So you can, if you have to sort of log everything each time you change a border or track how many hours your trucker's allowed to actually work, when they have to take a break, when they're allowed to go, do they have too much load, are they too light?
And it's all different depending on the province and state.
In state, right.
And so as a consequence of that, the way they used to put it in Alberta is they literally measured the person who did all that paperwork in terms of how many barrels per day do we have to produce to pay for that person.
Really?
And when they changed governments from one party to another, you can guess which ones they were. Apparently, the burden went from something like 10 barrels a day up to 100 barrels a day. So they were putting it in those terms that you could think about how many kilometers do you have to travel for revenue to pay off just the reporting part. Or adding all the sensors into your vehicle so that you can track it with the tech. And again, you get into what happens when you change provinces. Like Quebec didn't really put a carbon price on. New Brunswick did.
Yeah.
We had the clean fuel standard. So each time you're crossing a border, you have to sort of think through how would this affect the business trying to operate interprovincially.
Well, it sounds very grim.
Let's take a break.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
Compose ourselves and we'll see if we can get our...
Let's see if we have in the next segment, let's see if we have a way out.
Yes.
There is a way out.
Let's talk about the bright side, the upside of that.
Let's talk about that way.
So we're going to take a few minutes. We're going to check on our public service announcements. We really appreciate CHCO for granting us this hour to be on the station, and we'll be right back with Herb Emery after this.
Hi there, welcome back to the Carr Brothers Show. It's episode 135. I'm Jack.
And I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jody, the third of the three Carr brothers. And we have UNB economist and professor Herb Emery helping us and you, our viewers, to understand, get our head wrapped around tariffs and trade barriers and trade wars, I guess, for lack of a better word, on what's going on here throughout the U.S. and Canada. And we ended the last segment with a little bit of a grim, daunting task for our province and our country. And we want to know, is there light at the end of the tunnel for us?
There's definitely light at the end of the tunnel, but we have to sort of go through a grieving process that the way we've been doing things in Canada, politically, economically, can't continue. There has to be a different focus in terms of what our priorities. And as much as New Brunswickers are going to hate it, the economy has to come back to the forefront for a while. And what that means is that we have to stop treating business as sort of here to serve us and understand that business has options in the new world that's opening under Trump. And we're going to have to think about how do we create the conditions to make it profitable to do a business in New Brunswick. If we do that, if we can create the conditions that get the investment, that raise the productivity, the workers that go to those companies are going to do quite well. And again, this is what we know from history under free trade, that the initial transition away from the protected branch plant economy to the open trading economy, and New Brunswick is the only maritime province that really benefited from NAFTA. There was a big expansion of trade from the province internationally to the US. Nova Scotia and PEI never showed the same gains. They just stayed reliant on the domestic market for the most part.
So why is that?
Because we have pulp and paper, we have the refinery.
On the border.
The refinery is a miracle when you think about it. 80% of its output goes to the U.S., and they're competing, they've got a huge market share against U.S. refiners. And so when you think about that should be a success story, instead it's something people don't even recognize. The refinery is like half of our export value.
Well, like the property tax incentives there at Irving Oil, there's other incentives that have been given to so-called big industry, and that is frowned upon by the general public,
In New Brunswick.
In New Brunswick.
In Quebec, do you think they frown on big subsidies to corporations?
I don't know.
No. It's part of their industrial policy. If you go to Ontario, where they were throwing $60 billion in total at electric vehicle battery plants, do you think they frown on bailouts for industry? The auto industry under Harper got $4 billion. The energy sector, when it was collapsing in the 2010s, nothing. Not even to do the well remedial cleanup. So in New Brunswick, voters hate what they call corporate welfare or helping capital. What they don't recognize is it's happening in every other province, and in the States, the economic developers are offering all kinds of incentives to meet the factors.
Everywhere the market is so competitive. We've seen it in Canada.
So the government has to do maybe a good job or a better job, or at least part of their job has to be the cost benefit of what that investment is. And maybe there's no winning in the New Brunswick public, but they're going to give a certain amount of millions on something. It has to be seen that that's actually an investment, and we're going to actually make money off of that.
So they have to move away from being seen as giving cash to business. They have to figure out a way to reduce the cost of energy to producers. They have to figure out a way to reduce the tax burden on producers compared to other jurisdictions. One of the weirdest things I see is that when everyone does our tax is too high in New Brunswick, they don't compare to other places. They just go, no, it seems okay. But when you compare the property tax burden, which is where New Brunswick really stands out, like our corporate income tax statutory rates compared to everywhere else. But when you look at the C.D. Howe Institute's reports, it's always the property tax on business that really raises us up to a particularly high level of taxation.
So each of those elements have to be looked at in terms of retaining or attracting business to be in New Brunswick. What's the cost of doing business? And someone can go just about anywhere, potentially stay in the U.S. or go with the competition that Trump is creating for us. We have to get real serious about what these incentives and what the cost of doing business here is, and do we want business to be here in New Brunswick?
And we have to take a productivity lens back to things that, again, in Canada and New Brunswick, all the provinces, we've had stagnant productivity now for over a decade. No investment coming in.
I remember.
And no innovation going on. So the ICT sector, which everyone's hyped about, hasn't changed from 4% of GDP for decades.
So could you see if the government wants to lower cost of tax and energy, that in return the company has to maybe be a bit more efficient, or is that a no-win either?
Well, that's what you hope will happen.
But can you make it so that maybe they make a commitment that they would do something with their productivity as well, or at least tie it into some sort of incentive to?
So you can try to control it, and that's what we do with brewing, right? We give differential tax rates based on how big you get, and it's really a disincentive to get good at it. If you start producing a lot, we're going to tax you more.
Well, we're lowering their costs for property tax and for energy, but what are they doing to lower their cost on productivity?
Unfortunately, in the short run, they're staying here. That's our benefits.
So that's our negotiating power.
In New Brunswick, there's a really unique cultural thing about wanting to control business business and capital, or even telling business how to do their business. So this whole idea that in Ontario, I find it kind of laughable that someone would come in and say, we're going to give you this subsidy in return, we expect this. They tried it with the Caterpillar plant in London, Ontario.
Okay.
Then Ontario gave them a huge bailout to build locomotives. It would continue it. The company then came in and said, we want to move to Indiana. It's $15 an hour instead of $30 an hour for labor. And the Ontario government said that would violate our agreement. The company went to the union and said, if you take $15 an hour, we'll stay. They obviously said, forget it. They went to Indiana.
Right.
So these agreements and conditions, if the firm exits, what can you do?
And what do you have to show for it? No jobs. And can New Brunswick compete with other jurisdictions when it starts talking about subsidies and more incentives?
Well, we try. We do try through our,
I know we do, but can we when we get in this open market
Into this
with, what
situation.
Trump's doing?
So
Can we even compete?
Historically, yes, New Brunswick is punching way above its weight. Like the heavy industry it's had and has kept.
Yeah.
It didn't happen by accident. It was all policy design. So you read Donald Savoy's work on Harrison McCain, you'll find out McCain's was a creation of government development activities and lots of subsidies, including the R&D on potatoes. If you go to the refinery, again, government was heavily involved in making the conditions right for that. When they were trying to do Repsol, again, government was trying to create the conditions. What's missing today is the same ideas come up, like let's do hydrogen in Beldoon, but we don't see government with the same kind of willingness to sort of bear down and say, how do we make this happen? They did it with mining. And when things fell apart with Robichaud, he brought in Noranda to get rid of Casey Irving's influence, and he created a really unhealthy dynamic, which was to try and encourage competing interests to come in to go up against your home teams, which just makes it harder for your home teams to compete externally.
Yeah.
So in a lot of cases, it's the DNA of this province used to be really going hard up to getting new industries and businesses, and that's the legend of Frank McKenna as well. The New Brunswickers on the ropes broke all the rules in Canada. Like I remember when he started going for call centers, the reaction in Alberta was, he's not allowed to do that. He's not supposed to be poaching our jobs or our companies, but he did it.
Yeah.
So when I moved here, I told the government they should be thinking more like pirates if they want to get some capital instead of sort of some kind of gentleman's duel to
Just
get
a
it.
nice neighbor. Nice neighbor doesn't
yeah.
get it.
Go for it. Like, go after it and be a bit mercenary about it. But unfortunately, with an aging population that doesn't really see a value of having our own producing economy, they see the pollution, they see the inequality. They prefer a government that just lives off of the feds. So right now, our reliance on the federal government amounts to 16% of our GDP, whereas the reliance on manufacturing is only 10%. So this presence of transfers to individuals, transfers to business, government services, it's kind of eroded a lot of the impetus for us to say we really need to be better at attracting capital and getting kinds of companies. And you'll see it just in the way governments talk about being selective. They don't want these energy plays or energy investments. What they'd really like to see is more tech companies. And I don't think you have the control in this region. Like, the comparative advantage is always going to be in the resource base. So if we go back to what conservative governments in the province tried to do, improve the regulatory environment for mining. Could you get a mine up and operational in this province within a decade? If you can, you're beating Canada by about 10 years, I think. You'd start to get some of those investments coming in, but we haven't resolved social license. So what could we do to make things better? We've got to roll up sleeves, and we got to go back to what we knew we had to do around 2015. Resolve social license, deal with energy costs, figure out the red tape to harmonize, but make business easier. And so there is a way to get out of this. The big thing in 1982 was to strike the MacDonald Commission and look at options to raise productivity again. We got NAFTA. But we don't have governments right now that want to look outside for expertise or be beholden to somebody who says this is a good idea. They like to do it themselves, and it seems increasingly on a campaign trail.
Yeah, and it's hard, and it's counter. You know, it's hard to do it by themselves when obviously there's been an exodus of that kind of capacity. Let's say so. Wow. Well, this is quite a discussion, and a lot of challenges. We'll have to get the Premier on our show.
Maybe.
Yeah, and answer some of those. She's already mentioned that she didn't think that there was room for subsidy or bailout or anything like that, but we'll get her on to talk about that too. We should try anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't you agree, guys?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes, we want to know, and the people want to know.
Yeah.
Maybe once she gets back from Washington D.C. and some of that uncertainty maybe smooths out, or they know, and maybe it never will.
She has a very tough job. She's very qualified to take it on. Just, I think that once the fire of fighting with Trump settles down, I'm hoping that they start to recognize that there's a lot of control they have to do policies that can make things a lot better. But the timing may not be right for someone like me to have that discussion with her. And again, I may be in Alberta soon if the discussion goes badly. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think you mentioned earlier, try to focus on what we have control over, and probably that's a good advice in our own households or in our own communities, in our own province. What can we control, and try to focus on that? Maybe a good first step too, instead of being distracted by all the distractions. Well, we've really appreciated you coming on and helping us out.
My pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, and I believe we're going to have Herb back again very soon. I hope so. Well, yes. Keep working through all this. Let's take a break on this segment, and we'll come back for a great, important announcement that we have Jeff to tell us, and myself, of what Jeff has in store after his career in politics. So stay right with us here on the Carr Brothers. We'll be right back. Hello there. Welcome back to the Carr Brothers Show. It's episode 135. I'm Jack.
And I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jody, the third of the three Carr Brothers. And apparently we have big news,
Yes.
Jack.
Yes, we do.
Into that now.
Yes, we do. Well,
As we know, I've been a real estate agent for almost 11 years now, I'm into my 11th year.
That's right.
And we've had our real estate team for probably about 7 years with Cheryl, my wife, as our chief operating officer and administrative officer. And we've had a couple of vacancies in the last few months. So, and I'm going to tell you, I see your sign everywhere. The sign is everywhere. Jack Carr, they still think you're running in politics with that many signs.
These signs don't get torn down as often.
Yes.
Do get torn down some, but not as often.
You're very busy, very successful. A lot of people rely on you for their real estate needs.
Yes.
Yeah, and we've done very well. And so we've got some great announcement, don't we, Jeff?
Yeah. So as of today, I will be officially joining the Jack Carr real estate team. Brand new realtor. Looking forward to joining Jack and Cheryl and another gentleman that will be coming along, and I'll let you talk a little bit more about that. But I was very excited when Jack brought the topic up to me, and we talked it through, and had a couple other opportunities, some discussions, but this feels like the right thing to do. It's a very interesting gig to learn, an industry that I'm really looking forward to. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're young in our lives so far, so I really looking forward to helping you guys build your business and your team, and seeing if I can be part of that. And I've worked for Jody in the past, and I really enjoyed that. I didn't get fired, so I must have got through it all right. Now to be able to work with you and your team will be exciting.
Well, it's exciting, and I know, with my experience as an MLA, it certainly helped, because I think one of the big roles of being a real estate agent is being a problem solver and coming up with solutions and helping people navigate through buying and selling homes. It's their number one asset, number one investment that they have, and I think you'll do that very well from your experience, not only as an MLA, but as a minister, and then previous to that as in the construction business, landscaping, excavating business for 25 years.
Yeah, you're always problem solving all the way through it, even in construction stuff, dealing with homeowners and how they should situate their houses on their lots, and always giving suggestions. So you're problem solving all the time, and you had us elected. Working for Joe, we were problem solvers too, as executive assistants.
Yes.
It just feels natural. There's a lot of work to becoming a realtor. I don't want people to think that they can just go out tomorrow and pay the fee and it's all done. There's a lot of work. It's a very professional, regulated organization here in the province of Brunswick through the New Brunswick Real Estate Association. So, but it's, for me, time well invested, and we'll move forward from there. So we'll get situated, and I'll get the rest of my training and my job shadowing done with you, and get ready for posting season that's coming up soon, and the market will take off again, and we'll see where we go with it. But
Oh, we also want to announce too that another agent, he's been an agent for a year and a half, and he'll be joining our team at the same time, Nick McMullen. Nick is transferring, eventually retiring from the military. Young, nice young family as well, lives in Wassas, New Brunswick, and we're very excited to have him join the team with you at the same time, and I think we're going to be a great team to be able to help New Brunswickers buy and sell homes.
No, it's exciting. Can't wait.
And I'm very excited.
Jody.
I'm very excited to announce that I will be taking over the Brian Whitaker Law Office in Ormocto as well. So we're growing. Brian will stay on as a part-time, limited basis. But we'll have two full-time offices in Ormocto and in Fredericton, and offering our clients both locations to look after wills, property transactions as well, and probate and whatnot. So it really ties into, I guess, what we've all been doing over the years is customer service. People can trust the Carr name with the Carr brothers to look after their legal and real estate transactions, and we're also there. What I like too, Jack, you always also are connecting people to other solutions with their home investments. Even if it's not the realtor, you connect them to people that they need.
Government services and different things.
Yeah, and people appreciate that. So, boys, this is great. We really appreciate our viewers, and congratulations, Jeff.
Thank you.
On a transition. Congratulations, Jack, for that as well. And always proud of where you're going, both of you, and continuing to grow and to support, I guess, the public in what you're offering. So it's going to be very exciting things to look forward to with Jeff and Jack at the Jack Carr Real Estate Team. Yeah, well, that's going to be great, and we want to thank our viewers of watching the Carr Brothers show. Glad that we had Herb Emery on
Great
earlier.
episode.
Oh yeah, very good. Shows the seriousness, of course, of what we have in store, but hopefully a little glimmer of hope that there are experts in our province like Herb Emery that can help us. That's right.
Take some tough decisions, though, and tough choices by a government, but our future depends on it here in New Brunswick.
Well, and it doesn't have to be so tough if they are working with people, working with the experts, and putting people first in those policy decisions, and hoping that they can explain those decisions as well, so people will know that,
Key, isn't it?
that those are the best decisions that need to go forward, so we all win. Okay. Well, let's wrap it up at that, and thank our viewers for watching on the Carr Brothers Show, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
Good night.